Folks, James Swift here of Uncommon Journalism. It's been a while since we've updated the website, but we are going through a rebranding process. We're kind of taking a more lifestyle, pop culture approach. You're still going to get the hard-hitting stuff. We're going to be still looking at all the seedy subjects out there in society, but we're also going to be taking a look more at the entertainment side of things and branching out to different forms of literary expressionism. And one of the first people we actually had on board for the new rebranded Uncommon Journalism is Miss Kristen Gilotti here. She is a fantastic writer here from the Atlanta area, and if you haven't checked out the website lately, she's had two really great articles come up. One, an interview with Miss Amanda Wise from the Elm Street movies, and a retrospective on Friday the 13th, which is the subject of today's long, meandering podcast we're doing today. We're actually going to be ranking all the Friday the 13th movies from the worst to the absolute best. But before that, of course, got to introduce Kristen, so I'll let you have the ground floor here. Just let everybody know about who you are.
Okay, thank you, James. Hi, folks. This is Kristen Gilotti, and I am so happy to be new, but also a fantastic freelance writer for Uncommon Journalism. And again, James, thanks so much for the past two articles. And as I continue to prepare for more, I am a horror geek. And I am ecstatic to be talking about the countdown to the Friday the 13th movies, as I was an 80s child. And again, growing up in the 1980s brings back a lot of nostalgia, and I am looking forward to that tonight. So, James, let's do it.
All right, so yeah, you brought up a really great talking point. You're already hitting mine before I get to them. You know, growing up, I was a child of the 80s as well. I mean, people kind of forget, just how ubiquitous the Friday the 13th series was. I mean, you had Jason toys, you had Jason video games, you had Jason Halloween costumes. It was really kind of inescapable. So what is your earliest recollection of the Friday the 13th mythos?
Well, I will start off by saying I was nauseated by the VHS front cover for Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, when I was a kid. That was released in 1988, and shortly after that time, again, when VHSs were so popular, I shunned video stores and grocery markets and any facilities where it was possible to rent and buy movies. And my parents were so perplexed that I was avoiding these type of errands because they were not horror fanatics. And at that time, neither was I. Needless to say, I was a very wimpy kid, like I had stated, by being intimidated by you see like half of Jason, half of Team Shepherd, and then blood dripping like right on the bottom cover of the front cover of the VHS. I mean, who would not pork up their dinner as a kid? You know what I'm saying? But on the other hand, I was entertained by the Friday the 13th opening theme, because the zany music brought out the modernisms of the 1980s. That film was released in 1982, and in my opinion, I believe that 1982 was the year where the 80s were identified, whether it be the movies, the styles, the music, the politics, just all of those elements of the decade.
Yeah, and I guess for me, growing up in the Atlanta area, we had a local TV station. It was 36 back in the analog days, called WATL. And pretty much every Saturday, they would just play a matinee from like noon until midnight of, 1980s horror movies. And it seemed like at least once a month they'd show at least, 2 or 3 of the Friday the 13th movies. So that was kind of my introduction to the entire series. I mean, outside of the Nintendo game, which really deserves its own podcast alone right there.
Oh, yes, I agree, James. I mean, the Nintendo game, and there were also Ataris back then, which was very similar to Nintendo, but either way, Nintendo and Ataris were very popular for video games.
And it all kind of comes full circle going to Friday the 13th Part 4, but we'll get to that bridge when we get there. All right, so I think we can both agree that, if you look at the Friday the 13th movies from an objective lens, they're not, quote-unquote, great movies in the traditional sense. I mean, they're kind of lacking in plot, acting not always the best. I mean, the directing, not exactly Schindler's List we're dealing with most of the time here, but for some reason, I'm just always utterly, entranced by them. I keep coming back to them. I mean, there are really great movies by, guys like Kurosawa and Bergman that, I've seen once or twice, but I've seen Friday the 13th Part 6 like 18 times. It seems like, yeah, every time it comes on cable, I have to watch it. So is it just me? Is there something kind of oddly sort of comforting about these movies? It kind of keeps bringing me back to them.
And James, it's funny you say that because like you said, the Friday the 13th, again, they are underrated. Some of them were even not rehearsed. But still at the same time, these Friday the 13th movies have become cult classics. And it is astonishing how these movies are still recognized, like after all these years. I may point out that I have met a couple of the cast members at the local horror convention centers, and it has just, I wouldn't say that it's been a blessing, but it's just been very entertaining seeing the characters, quote, come to life and just discussing with them how it was to work on set, how they interacted with the director, what they missed most about the 80s, and it just brings out that great deal of nostalgia. And then, of course, just watching the movies, nearly 40-some years later, they're just not cult classics of the Halloween season, but all year round, especially if you are horror fans like us.
And ultimately, what would you say is the most appealing thing about the Friday the 13th series for you as a fan?
Now, are you referring to the just one specific movie or all of the Friday the 13th franchises?
Oh, just the entire franchise.
The entire franchise? Well, that is a really good question. Again, I think it goes back to when I was an 80s child. And again, that was around the time when Ataris and VHSs were really popular. And of course, back then, I mean, like I said, I was petrified of horror movies. I was afraid of having nightmares. I mean, I could not look at Jason. I could not look at Freddy. Chucky scared the Jesus out of me. But as far as the Friday the 13th franchises, I think they, again, not only do they outline the 80s, but I think they really bring out the elements of the decade with its style and its fashion. And we have also had some notable actors, which I will talk about later in the Friday the 13th movies. I was just going to say, which brings out more of that entertainment with the summer slashers.
And I think for me, the hypothesis I've been working with for a couple of years now is when you talk about Friday the 13th fandom, it seems to me that one of the overarching things I'm seeing from fans is it's not just about the movies. It's like every time you talk about the movies, you also talk about the experiences around them, because to me, the Friday the 13th movies have always kind of been the epitome of the communal movie. It's not just something you watch alone in your apartment, although you do that sometimes during the Halloween season. But to me, growing up, it was all about going to slumber parties, having birthday parties. You'd always watch the Jason movies. You'd always have guys over. And to me, it's one of those things where you kind of have so many experiences outside of the movie tied to the movies. And I think that's something that will be pretty evident here when I start going over some of my mullings for some of these movies here. But do you kind of feel the same way that one of the reasons why the movies may be so popular and beloved is because they're so tied to our memories of youth and some of our experiences in the 80s and 90s?
And most definitely. And this particularly ties into Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, because we are residents of Georgia. And that movie was filmed in parts of Rutledge, Georgia, which is called Camp Daniel Morgan, which is available to tourists, visitors, and anyone who dares to spend the night there, because that is possible. And it's also the music, too. I was always fascinated with the soundtrack of Friday the 13th Part 6, because you had the mid-1980s rock with Alice Cooper's The Man Behind the Mask, and Felony, which was I'm No Animal, and that movie flows freely with that type of music, especially in the scene where the military is unable to defeat Jason, and then, of course, they slaughter off the counselors. I mean, there's laughter, there's the big hair, there's the drugs, there's the sex, there's the blood, and everything that brings out, I mean, obviously we could not perform those as children of the 1980s, but even so during that time, I mean, that was primarily what went on in that decade. And not just Friday the 13th Part 6, but the Friday the 13th franchises, they really bring out all those elements, which has drawn horror fans to the movies. And I think that that's why that they became year-round cult classics.
All right, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into the marrow on those particular subjects, but I think it's about time we get this countdown started. So, Kristen, are you ready?
Yes, I am. And I am so ready to talk about Friday the 13th Part 4, which, in my opinion, brings out the epitome of horror.
You know, I'm not going to contest that. I think that that's pretty close to being an accurate statement. But to begin with, we're doing the reverse countdown, so we're starting off with what we mutually agree is the worst movie in the Friday the 13th series. No surprise here, the 2009 remake. So, Kristen, what exactly is it about this movie that you did not enjoy?
You know, and it has been a long time since I've seen that movie. You know, I mean, it's hard to say because I know that there are individuals who probably enjoy the Friday the 13th remake, but again, I mean, I considered I was going to say low points because the acting and the plot and the setup, it just wasn't comparable to the original Friday the 13th, which was released in May 9th of 1980. I mean, although like technology has expanded over the years, and that definitely brought out, I was going to say like just technical aspects of the Friday the 13th remake released in 2009. But again, I just could not compare it to the original, and therefore it was just, I'm going to be candid about this, but it was just not worth my time. You know, from the 2009 versus the 1980 film. And whoever is watching this, please don't be offended.
Well, I will say this. It's not the worst horror remake. I think the Elm Street remake from 2010 was way, way worse than this one. But for me, you know, the 2009 remake just didn't actually feel like a Friday the 13th movie. It felt like, you know, you take off the hockey mask, it could be any number of, you know, serial killer movies. And I think one of the things that's really kind of evident is that the Friday the 13th formula doesn't really seem to work outside of the 1980s. You know, they tried doing this in the 90s and the early 2000s, just didn't pan out the same way. So there are some things here. I mean, you know, I think the special effects were fantastic. I think Derek Mears did a pretty good job playing a new wave kind of Jason. But just overall, it just felt too un-Friday the 13th like for my liking.
And yes, James, I concur with that. And also, I have met Derek Mears several times at the convention centers. And, I mean, he's a great guy, very outgoing, excellent actor. And, you know, and of course, I, you know, just want to approach him professionally. But again, at the same time, like you said, it was, there was no recap of the 1980s, and they really brought out the 90s, the 2000s. I mean, they seem to be going everywhere with the decades, as opposed to recapping the nostalgia of May 9th of 1980 when the original Friday the 13th was released.
That's kind of the general problem with making, you know, new wave slashers to begin with, because you have so much new technology that it kind of defeats the purpose. You know, it's not like it is in 1982 where, you know, you're out in the cabin in the woods, you don't have a cell phone, but now you do. Kind of makes it a little iffier to kind of get that plot going. So I think Friday the 13th is kind of sort of symbolic of the problems we're having making, you know, these updated versions of these classic movies. It just doesn't kind of fit in that timeline.
Right, and also with the, as you were saying about the cell phones, I mean, during the remake of Friday the 13th, I mean, if you knew that you were, you know, next to be slaughtered, all you had to do was call on your cell phone and say, "Help me, come get me. I mean, this psychotic killer is stalking me." Whereas in the original, and even all throughout the 80s, I mean, you are basically just, I was going to say, screaming and yelling for help, going from place to place, and in this case for Friday the 13th, from just anywhere to safety of Camp Crystal Lake. I mean, you were basically on your own, like doing the physical type of work to fight for your life, whereas, and again, going back to where technology was available, I mean, all you had to do was just pick up the phone and say, "Hey, come get me. I'm being slaughtered." So, again, it was just, again, the remake of the Friday the 13th, again, it's not the worst horror movie, but it's not the greatest.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I feel. It's one of the movies where the kill scenes are pretty good, the dialogue is absolutely atrocious. It takes too many liberties with the Jason mythos for my liking. But I don't know, maybe, 10, 15 years down the line we'll be able to kind of see this through different lenses. But just for the time being, got to be the worst Friday the 13th movie in both our books.
Yes. Yes, for sure. And I'm pretty sure I made that my point where, yes, the Friday the 13th remake, oh my goodness, the Friday the 13th remake it's not something that I would watch during the Halloween season or during the summer season, especially in the pandemic moment where we've actually had time to watch the Friday the 13th franchises, including all other horror movies.
And one of the theses I've long held is that, if you're a director, having a Friday the 13th movie is both the best job and worst job in the world. It's the best job in the world because you have the winning formula. You have a bunch of kids that go out and they have wacky shenanigans, and then a guy in a hockey mask kills them off. Easiest thing to do in the world, but also as a filmmaker, sometimes you try to do something different because you don't want to make the same movie over, 18 times. But the thing about the Jason movies, it seems like every time a director tries to do something new with the formula, it ends up kind of faltering. And I think that's evident by the movies that come in at number 10. It's a tie here on the ranking list of the Friday the 13th movies. We've got Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X. So 2 movies from 1993 and 2002. Am I calling it correctly?
Yes, those are the correct years. And by then, as you can see, here is another one of the, again, like low points with Jason X and Jason Goes to Hell. And the reason that I gave these low ratings is because Camp Crystal Lake has basically derailed. And it's been bizarre seeing Jason, torment his victims in space. And then, of course, the pointless Jason Goes to Hell, which was the final Friday. Like, let's put an end to Jason Voorhees once and for all. No more legendary Jason.
Yeah, after making the film studio like what, $500 million in the 80s, they're going to kill off the entire franchise?
Exactly. And the thing is, that's pretty high for these low budget type of horror movies. And then, yes, I mean, once you get Jason Goes to Hell, I mean, that was just putting an end to it. Just making it very conclusive where, again, I don't agree with Jason in space. But again, Jason still lives. Jason still haunts Camp Crystal Lake. Jason still slaughters any victims who invade his property.
If I had to pick one with these two, I'd probably go with Jason X a little bit slightly. But they're both, I think, really subpar movies, which kind of do a disservice to the franchise. I think going back to Jason Goes to Hell, the problem with this movie is Jason isn't actually in it. And he has like 5 minutes of screen time in the entire picture?
And I was about to say that. There is also limited Jason scenes. So what is the whole purpose of calling it, or what's the whole purpose of giving it another Friday the 13th franchise?
My favorite thing about the entire movie Jason Goes to Hell is something completely random. It's the part where they're actually making Jason hamburgers.
That's interesting. Wow, I mean, like the comical part of that, I don't know about the hamburger part, but again, with not seeing Jason as much, it just defeated the purpose of creating another Friday the 13th or just adding more to the plot of the Friday the 13th franchises.
Yeah, there's just so many things about that movie that just really doesn't seem like in continuity. Probably my favorite character in the entire movie would be the Creighton Duke bounty hunter guy. And even then, like, his dialogue is just so weird and utterly random. You kind of wonder, did they kind of like make up the script on the fly?
The script on the fly, yes. If so, but again, like you were saying, the continuity, it just had vanished. It came to a halt. It derailed. And I wish I could think of, I was going to say a more stronger word to say it. But then again, we are still at what they call the worst Jason movies. But it's again, I mean, it just ruined the whole purpose of the main antagonist, which was Jason Voorhees.
Pretty much the only reason I think Jason Goes to Hell is even remembered nowadays is because it sets up Freddy versus Jason, the movie we've been waiting years and years for, us Reagan babies. Jason X is the movie in the middle, and this is, I think, a spectacular failure, but at least it's an entertaining spectacular failure. It's kind of the trope is, you know a horror franchise is dead when they put it in space. It happened with Critters, Leprechaun, Jason, obviously kind of into the series there. But I think at least it had some redeeming elements. So if you had to pick one, Jason X, Jason Goes to Hell, which one do you think is slightly superior?
I would go with Jason X because, again, it's not every day that you would see a psychotic serial killer stalking you in space. And I would say, going back to what you were saying, the entertaining spectacular, that would be Jason X for sure, because a killer in space that really brings out a unique way to make a horror movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where if you look at the audacity of the producers to make a big budget sci-fi movie where you have anti-gravity and you got spaceships blowing up, and I think they probably spent like, what, $15 on the entire budget?
It is. Again, it's yet another low-budget movie. But again, I mean, I liked the acting. Again, they had really did very well with designing the props. Also, the setup to make it look like Jason was terrorizing those in space.
Yeah, and I think the humor in this one actually worked a little bit better than some of the other movies in the franchise. And if nothing else, Jason X, I got some druthers about it, but at least it has one of the absolute best kills in the entire franchise. I think you know what scene I'm talking about, right?
You bet. You bet. And again, too, in addition to that, I was going to say that killer scene, and you could see like another entry to a new decade, because again, that movie came out in 2002, and it's not so much piggybacking the 1980s, but also bringing out the technical aspects, the horror, the styles, and the fashion of the 2000s, which is unbelievably 20 years ago. So needless to say, I mean, these Friday the 13th franchises they are just going by.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. I remember actually watching this a couple of years back, and I was actually feeling nostalgic because like half the cast were all like Sci-Fi Channel staples. They're like always on shows like Andromeda. They come on like on Saturday afternoons, like back in the day. So it's kind of fun to revisit the cast there and see what these old TV actors were up to. So yeah, totally buy into that. We're starting to see early 2000s nostalgia now. It's pretty crazy.
It is. And as far as going into Freddy versus Jason, the movies start to advance a little bit, because, I mean, even though it's not one of the top films, it is they still have grisly murders, and it's a good recap of the 1980s horror movies, because this time Jason Voorhees is in competition with another famous killer, Freddy Krueger, and the elements of this movie are somewhat ecstatic, because Freddy still victimizes people in his dreams, but since Jason was stronger and Freddy was very aware of it, Jason was able to pull them out of Freddy's dreams. Jason was able to pull them out of Freddy's dreams so he could slaughter them off. And especially during the ending scene where Freddy and Jason are just wrestling and fighting off each other because Jason is pissed because Freddy invaded his territory. And then finally you get to the ending where Jason dramatically and slowly comes out of the water and is carrying Freddy's head. Now, Freddy looks at the audiences and does a very evil wink, but it also lets audiences know that, okay, it's over, but is the horror really coming to an end? Meaning that did Jason really win this competition? Which is one of the reasons why I liked Freddy versus Jason. And also, it was a good time for this movie to come out, because by then, The 1980s were 20-some years later. And just to do a recap of these horror movies, I mean, you could tell, like, and not just horror fanatics, but I mean, even just movie lovers as well. Like, I could see the enthusiasm and, like, just the ready for, like a 20-year reunion horror movie.
Yeah, and of course that is Freddy versus Jason coming in at number 9 in our countdown. And it's really funny that you bring that up about being sort of a set piece which collects everything together, because when this movie came out, I was a senior in high school. So my entire childhood, I was weaned on Freddy and Jason. So for me, this is like an early graduation present, right? To finally see these two titans of the slasher genre face off. And I remember watching it in the theater with a packed house. Everybody's going crazy, and I absolutely loved it. Then a couple of months later, it comes out on DVD, and I watch it for the second time, and I'm kind of only halfway as impressed as I was the first time around. So to me, it's sort of the epitome of the audience participation movie. You got to have the crowd in there to get it going. But this one, I think it does have a little bit more good stuff than bad stuff in it. But of course, you really can't talk about it without talking about the Kane Hodder controversy. So do you have any feelings on that?
Yes, and actually this was one of Kane Hodder's, in my opinion, I think this was one of his better movies, because, again, this movie came out in 2003, and I had just recently graduated from college, and one of my friends and I went to see Freddy versus Jason in theaters because we were psyched that, again, it had the notable killer, Kane Hodder, portraying... No, wait a minute, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry, no. Jason was not Yes, Kane Hodder did not portray Jason in Freddy vs. Jason. It was Ken Kersinger,
who was a stunt double in Friday the 13th Part 8. But that's still kind of a sticking point for a lot of horror fans, because I think it's pretty obvious Kane Hodder is the best actor to play Jason. He had the mannerisms, he had the identity, the vibe. So having him not involved in the movie, I think, was really sort of a turn down for long-term fans of both genres.
It was, and I think that's why I made a mistake, because, yes, Kane Hodder was, in my opinion, one of the best Jason killers. But getting back to Freddy versus Jason, again, Jason was portrayed by Ken Kersinger, and, of course, Robert Englund reprised his role as Freddy Krueger. But, again, I was a recent college graduate. My friend and I were psyched about... like I was going to say, both villains returning. So when I first saw it in theaters, I mean, I loved it because, they had a couple of horny and corrupted teenagers smoking up on Elm Street. And then they also brought up their elements of drinking and being so oblivious on Crystal Lake. So I really liked it how they joined them together. But then the downside to it was, once it came on CD, and then once I watched it when it was on TV, and just to rent it, I'm just not impressed anymore. Yeah,
there's... One of the things I did like was the CGI effects in the movie, because this is really the first major movie in both franchises where it's really heavily reliant on computer-generated imagery, and it looks, well, not really Lord of the Rings type quality, in my humble opinion, and it's really evident towards... the latter part of the movie where you have the big climactic Freddy vs. Jason fight, which I thought was pretty good, but I don't know, it just didn't live up to the hype. I think they could have gone a lot of different ways. You kind of expect them to kind of say, well, at some point, Jason and Freddy had some sort of altercation before the movies became canonical, but it never happened. So it's an entertaining monster movie, but not really fitting into either franchise, in my opinion.
Right, and also... And some of the acting. I mean, some of the scenes in Freddy vs. Jason. I remember when that one girl gave them mouth to mouth, and then I remember another actor said, "Oh, who is that?" And they really didn't know who both killers were. And once I saw it on TV, after a while, I was like, you know what? I just it wasn't entertaining as it was back in 2003.
And one of the things when you look at the Jason movies, the timeline is absolutely a mess. There's no way to figure out exactly when the movies take place canonically. One of the things I did not like about Freddy vs. Jason is apparently, canonically, of course, Camp Crystal Lake is in New Jersey, Elm Street is in Ohio, but they travel from location to location in like 5 minutes.
Yes. I mean, Yes, and I think that's how throughout the movie, that's where that they have trouble knowing, okay, who should win this competition? Or, I mean, is Jason invading Freddy's property, or is Freddy invading Jason's property? Like, that's where it's really, I mean, like, they're both there. I mean, like, you know, they're both tormenting their next victims, but it's just unknown of who appeared first.
And one of the things I will always lament is before this movie came out, there were like 30 or 40 different scripts for Freddy versus Jason. And the one I wish they would have made instead was actually like a procedural courtroom drama. Have you seen that script?
No, I haven't actually.
Oh, it would have been great. They actually have Jason going on trial for like 2,000 counts of murder, and Freddy like slowly takes over, and it's just a great, you know, sort of social satire.
Oh, James, you've got to be kidding me. You mean they actually had a couple scenes where Jason goes to court? Because you mentioned about trials and all that. You know, I find this very comical, seeing Camp Crystal Lake's, I was going to say Camp Crystal Lake's killer going to court.
Yeah, he has a public defender and everything. It actually he turned out pretty great. Remind me to send you an email link, and I'll shoot the script over to you. It's pretty fantastic. I think it's actually written by someone who actually worked on Law and Order, of all things. So, what we could have had.
Yes, and my day job as a legal assistant, again, that's, I was going to say, I think that just brought out the highlight of the night, finding out that Jason Voorhees, let's see, he's got a defense lawyer, he's going to court, and especially he's one of the non-talking villainous legends, so I am dying. Hey, how's that? I am dying to see this.
Yep. Not to spoil anything, but he doesn't confess.
I'm sure he doesn't. I was going to say there's no way that you could just like sit there silently, you know, with an axe or a machete or any weapon we can think of, and especially with your hockey mask on. Yeah, I don't see how you can win a case over that. But hey, anything is possible.
All right, and that brings us to number 8 on our countdown. Fittingly enough, the 8th installment in the Friday the 13th series, Jason Takes Manhattan. And I have a lot of feelings about this one, and I think this is probably the one, if I'm not mistaken, this may have been actually the first Friday the 13th movie I actually saw from front end to front end. But the thing I remember most about this was actually the commercial. Do you remember the trailers for this back in '89?
I certainly do. And I was also familiar with Kane Hodder's acting and also his portrayal in Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Yeah, I remember the trailer very well. And this came out in 1989 where, I mean, just by seeing it, again, like the fashion, the styles, the politics, and even like the settings, you could tell that the 1980s was sadly coming to an end.
Yeah, this is a really sort of metaphorical movie when you look at it like that.
Yes, and also it sidetracks the plot. And again, it focuses on high school graduates where they're on a cruise ship to take a field trip to Manhattan. And also, one ideal part about the title is it's called Jason Takes Manhattan, where he really is not terrorizing Manhattan until maybe like the last 45 minutes of the movie. And also with this movie this is the first film where Crystal Lake has derailed. Like, Camp Crystal Lake no longer exists. But one highlight of the movie, again, which has prompted me to watch it more often, is I had the pleasure of interviewing Tiffany Poulsen, who played the first victim, Susie Donaldson, in the beginning of the film. And again, we had a great conversation, how she went from acting to writing, how Friday the 13th Part 8 was her first major breakout role, and it was good. I really enjoyed meeting her. I enjoyed writing a story about her, and I actually learned more about behind the scenes of Friday the 13th Part 8. However, still, and again, not to be negative, but I still don't have it at the top of my best list for this Friday the 13th franchise.
Yeah, and Tiffany's gone on to have quite a bit of writing credits after this movie, hasn't she?
Yes, in fact, she wrote the script for Nancy Drew, and after Friday the 13th Part 8, she also appeared in Runaway Bride, with Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, where again she had to portray a naked scene in cold weather, which was very challenging for her because again she was at that time she was very ill and she was very susceptible to just illnesses like pneumonia, but she really wanted to have acting a part of her life. So she stuck with the film. I mean, she was very brave, very ambitious, and then before Friday the 13th Part 8, she did a couple of McDonald's commercials. But shortly after Runaway Bride, she went on to become a writer and also wants to do a director as well. Again, Tiffany was terrific, and I know that she will do well with her current and future endeavors.
So the criticism you always hear about Friday the 13th Part 8 is that despite being called Jason Takes Manhattan, Manhattan is in the movie for like 10 minutes maybe?
Yes, I mean, and like I was saying before, it's just, there's not a lot of Manhattan except when the main protagonists are running from Jason in the subway and in the restaurant, which, hey, he's coming after you. You know that they're going to get finished off, even though they don't. And in the end, Rennie finds her dog, she falls in love, and then it ends. But still, it doesn't really tie into the plot of Jason Takes Manhattan. And again, before, I wouldn't say irritated, but I was a bit disappointed how Camp Crystal Lake had ceased. Like, Camp Crystal Lake just did not exist anymore, which was the whole purpose of the Friday the 13th films.
And that's a great point. It's kind of bothered me for years and years now. Okay, so they start off the movie on a boat in Camp Crystal Lake. So how did they get from the lake to New York?
Yes, and from what I remember with watching Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason revives, again, underwater in Camp Crystal Lake, but somehow is able to work his way onto the cruise ship to terrorize these wild and crazy high school kids. But the entertaining part of the movie is they are unaware of who Jason is. With the previous Friday the 13th films, again, they were always warned. They were always given reports about who Jason Voorhees was. But this time, these group of kids, and they just went on partying, celebrated their high school graduation, didn't know who Jason was, and then all of a sudden he is stalking them on the ship.
And this is one of those movies where sometimes when you look at a Friday the 13th movie, its whole is greater than its parts. I think this is one of the entries where the parts are kind of greater than the wholes, because you got like maybe 3 or 4 really, really good scenes, and then everything else around is just kind of mediocre. I mean, you got the boxing death scene, which is probably one of the 10 best kills in the entire franchise. No complaints there.
I mean, you're wrestling with Jason. I was going to say the boxing, and then of course your head pops off. So I mean, I was going to say who would not call that a horror slasher, low budget film?
Yeah, and as minute as they actually are in the movie, when Jason actually does finally get to New York, those scenes are incredible. Those are just some of the best imagery in the entire franchise. The really small part, what I thought was brilliant, is when Jason actually first gets off the boat and he's in the dock and he looks up and he sees like the giant New York Rangers logo.
Yes, and at that time, because again, this is like, by then, this is 30-some years ago. And again, this was the end of the 80s. I mean, we were saying goodbye to the 1980s and welcoming the 1990s. And you could tell that specific scene really brings it out about how the next decade of horror is going to be for the 90s.
Yeah, but it's not the same 1980s anymore after that. I got a point there.
Unfortunately not. And again, not to get sidetracked, but James, I will have to say that I really do miss the 1980s. I mean, as we discuss about this, I just miss every aspect of the 1980s, and we can only live in the world of fiction from it.
I feel the pangs. I feel the pangs. The thing is, I was born in 86. I was only around for 4 years, so my actual cognitive memories of it, I might have one good solid year. But it just felt so comfortable and cozy and wide open.
Right. And I was born in 1980, and again, as a kid, I was restricted to so many events, obviously, but when I go to the convention centers and when I watch the movies now, like you could tell, the 1980s was just a very exciting time for everybody at any age.
All right, and speaking of the 80s, I think probably the most just definitionally 80s Friday the 13th entry of them all is also perhaps the most controversial, and I can be long-winded about this one. Number 7 on our countdown, Friday the 13th, Part 5. Now,
Okay.
I'll let you have the ground floor here because you ranked it pretty low on your list, and I had it, I think, number 3 or 4 on my list. So before I try to defend this movie, I'll just let you kind of go over here. What is it about this movie that hardcore Friday the 13th fans just sort of dislike the most?
Yes, and I know that you are very apologetic about this movie, but because there is no Jason Voorhees, the movie is very impromptu. However, I will admit it does have a very twisty ending where the paramedic turns out to be the son of one of the victims who was staying in the house with all the other individuals. But again, it was not a Jason Voorhees. It was just a portrayal of Jason who was traumatized and distraught because one of his kids was slaughtered by a non-Jason Voorhees related event. Does that make sense? So again, it's very impromptu. I mean, again, it's not. The acting, of course, it's under rehearsed, but they did have very good props. They did have very good setups. Again, this came out in 1985, so by then, you had the highlight of the 80s. But at the same time was where it reminded me of Halloween 3, where they dismiss Michael Myers and then they have their own plot going, which is very similar to Friday the 13th Part 5, where it just kind of stands out in the franchises of Friday the 13th. And then when you go to Part 6, Jason is reintroduced again. So to me, it was just it was an interruption which disappoints not only myself, but also horror fans.
Yeah, I keep waiting for the tides to kind of turn. Like, over the last couple of years, people used to really, really loathe Halloween 3, but now it's kind of become almost like a cult classic now, kind of redeemed over the years. So I'm saying,
there was no relevance or no relation to Michael Myers, whereas to Friday the 13th Part 5, there was no Jason Voorhees. Again, it was just a paramedic whose son was randomly killed, portraying Jason Voorhees because, he knew the legends, he knew the reports of Jason, and basically he was just impersonating that character, and he killed off so many people.
yeah, if this was called anything other than a Friday the 13th movie, I think it'd be heralded as a all-time slasher classic. It just has all of the great degenerate cinema elements in play here. It's just so quintessentially 80s. The fashion, the hairdos, the wardrobe. There's just so many really great, weird, iffy things about the entire movie. And it's one of those things where when you watch most horror movies, you have at least one relatable character. One person that you kind of say, okay, this is kind of the person I'm putting myself in their shoes and make them relatable. Okay, Friday the 13th Part 5, everyone is like a little bit of a lunatic. So there's really no one to kind of, really kind of put yourself in the shoes of. But there are just so many great scenes and so many memorable characters, and it's just so crude and crass and just completely unrefined. And to me, it's just it's the zeitgeist of the 1980s to me, where everything was just so. What's the word I'm looking for here?
Well, we are celebrating the 35th year of Friday the 13th Part 5, and again, I wish I could agree with some of your reviews, but again, Friday the 13th Part 5 is definitely on within one of the worst films. I really just can't say anything that much about it.
But you got so many, great small elements. You got like the part with the pseudo echo song going on, the guy with no light behind his eyes, which is a beautiful, beautiful song. And to me, this actually has my favorite 10-minute stretch of any Friday the 13th movie. And that's the part where Demon and his social worker go to his brother's camper, and there's this great sort of sequence where there's just so many elements thrown in. We're talking about like having egg rolls and pizza, and then there's like a scene in an outhouse, and all of this is just so wonderfully weird and cobbled together. And it all, of course, being a Friday the 13th, culminates with the guy who played Juwanna Mann getting impaled to death inside an outhouse.
Yes. And also there were some recognizable actors in the film. Miguel Ortiz, who also was in Return of the Living Dead, also stars in Friday the 13th Part 5. There was also the kid who played Dudley in Different Strokes. He returns as well. And then you also had Melanie Kinnaman, the main protagonist, who I don't believe she acts anymore, but she has appeared in convention centers, and from what I hear, she's very professional, very welcoming to her fans, and also, believe it or not, the victim who got her eyes poked out by, again, the quote, the so-called Jason, her name was Tina. She, and again, her name is Deborah Voorhees. Yes, believe it or not, her name is Deborah Voorhees, and she is a psychotherapist right now, which is hilarious given the fact that she portrayed a victim in the Friday the 13th franchises and is now a doctor.
Well, all I can say is, give it about 10 or 15 years. Eventually, everyone will see the light on A New Beginning. But I understand the criticism. I can see why people don't like it, but I'll keep being the apologist here.
Yes, and you are, I am very impressed because you are one of the first people who actually admires and is amused by the movie. And again, I'm very impressed. And I just found it very interesting how everyone is just so negative and pessimistic and just hates Friday the 13th Part 5. And then I finally meet someone where they like it. So I'm laughing.
We'll do a screening. I'll go through it scene by scene and point out all the artistic merits in there, the subtle intricacies of Friday the 13th Part 5.
All right, I'm up for that. Maybe you might convince me to be a fan of it, but I can't guarantee.
All right, and now we get to the midway point of our countdown. Fittingly enough, we're starting off with the original Friday the 13th from 1980. Of course, you did the recent retrospective for Uncommon Journalism. So yeah, really, what more can be said about this movie?
Yes, and the Friday the 13th, released on May 9th of 1980. With this movie, I was more impressed with the effects and the props because, again, although I love the original, you don't know, you're being introduced to the characters, to the plot, but again, what really sticks out is it's just, a figure watching them in the woods, a snake that is placed in one of their cabins, and again, as far as the effects, there's also the creative and bloody ways to kill the counselors. You had Ned, where his throat was slit, or Jack, where the pierced throat via an arrow through the bed. Marcy had an axe slammed on her head. Oh, that must have hurt. Ouch. Brenda was blinded by a light and thrown through a window. And oh my gosh, I'm wondering, before she was killed off, she probably could not see anything. Bill was pinned to a door by several arrows. And then, of course, Mr. Stephen Christie, the camp's owner, was hanging upside down. And as far as, I would have to say, the unique types of props, because in order to maintain the sanity and uncontrollable rage between Mrs. Pamela Voorhees, the original killer, and Alice Hardy, the sole survivor, they had them wrestling in the sand. A paddle, a frying pan, was also made for them to hit each other. There was also the machete for Alice to decapitate Mrs. Voorhees. And also, with the whole Friday the 13th, the original is, again, it's a spin-off to John Carpenter's Halloween, where it took place in one horrifying night, except with Friday the 13th. The counselors could have bypassed the killer if they listened to Crazy Ralph. In other words, use common sense, such as, don't go to Camp Crystal Lake. But again, to quote the movie's famous tagline, they were warned, they are doomed, and on Friday the 13th, nothing will save them. And that is exactly what happened. And since then, that's what made the horror linger on.
Yeah, it's one of those things where everyone has sort of a socio-political take on what the Friday the 13th movies are about. The one I hear all the time is that it's sort of like reactionary to the Reaganism conservatism, because after the 60s and 70s you just had so much bombardment of free love and copious drug use, and then the 80s roll around, all of a sudden you've got Friday the 13th being the new moral majoritarian figure, saying, hey, don't have sex in the woods, save it for marriage, don't drink, obey your parents, or else you'll get a corkscrew through the eyeball. So do you have any sort of take on that? I mean, is there actually like a underlying sort of, political message to these movies, or is it just kind of what you're wanting to see?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call it so much like a political aspect. I mean, because in the movie, like, it did happen. I mean, Mrs. Voorhees was pissed because her son, Jason, could not swim. He was, he drowned due to the lack of supervision because also, he drowned due to the lack of supervision because the counselors just wanted to run off and have sex, not watch the kids, and again, they would also sit around the campfires doing drugs, drinking, and again, that ties into the plot of why Mrs. Voorhees, the original killer, was so angered by the counselors, and that's why she slaughtered everyone off. She slaughtered everyone off, and which led to that excessive craziness.
One of the things that really impressed me going back and watched this movie a couple of weeks back is how good the cinematography is. And this is one of those movies where you go back and you watch it, it has sort of a different vibe. The camera work feels totally different from everything else in the series. I'm a big documentary guy, and it seems like at certain points it almost kind of takes on like an Earl Morris sort of Werner Herzog sort of scope.
And it is. I mean, the scenery. The scenery was very authentic because, as you know, that they used a real snake in the film. There was also the scene where Annie, the first camp counselor, is running away from the unknown killer at the time, but you still see the killer's feet. I mean, you see her, frantically and frightenedly, like running through the woods before the killer catches up with her and slits her throat. But yes, where it's set, on a camp, on the lake, in the woods. It was, for a horror movie, it was a very, very pretty scenery.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, the Jason movies are so, archetypical. When you think slasher movie, you automatically think Friday the 13th. But the thing is, the summer camp setting before this movie came out was actually pretty rare for horror movies. So it's actually kind of a trendsetter, though.
Yes, and also keep in mind that they did filming in 1979 because although the movie opens with the boy drowning the counselors being slaughtered in 1958, and then of course there was the talk about the boy drowning a year later in 1957. The film then moves to the present day, again, as fate would have it, Friday the 13th, but it was actually 1979. So, if anything, it was the late 70s, but we were about to, again, welcome the 1980s. But then again, as far as the scenery and the effects, we were still in the 1970s disco decade.
And of course, you can't talk about Friday the 13th without talking about Tom Savini's special effects. So everyone kind of says he's really the star of the movie. So do you think that's an adequate descriptor?
To a certain degree, yes, because, he did an outstanding job with the makeup with Friday the 13th because, again, back then, there was no technology, and then they also had, I assume that they had, no airbrushes, and if anything, makeup artists and designers and even the director and the producer, they were responsible for creating the artwork and the scenes for those movies. So again, limited pieces of artwork back then, I give Tom Savini a lot of credit for doing the makeup and the designs and just making everything look so bloody and grotesque and realistic for the Friday the 13th back in 1980.
And I've always kind of said, a lot of people like to give Halloween the credit for starting the slasher trend, but as far as I'm concerned, this is really the first true American slasher movie because it has all the ingredients. So what is it you think made this movie so popular? I mean, there are a lot of similar movies that came out in that time frame, but what was about this movie in particular that just really kind of, captured, the American consciousness the way it did?
Well, it was, again, it is, and it still has become one of the most popular horror movies of all time. And again, back then, it was just the whole acting, like the acting and the directing and the producing, like, took more effort than it would now. I mean, again, this movie came out when we were about to step foot into the 1980s decade. So again, I mean, horror movies although that they were low budget, but horror movies had a very different perspective back then. And also, one of the reasons why Friday the 13th has been, supposedly named America's favorite slasher is, I mean, this movie brought out the whole Friday the 13th franchises. It became a cult classic. I was going to say horror fanatics love it. And again, when they attend the convention centers, I mean, they get to meet some of their stars from not only this movie, but the whole Friday the 13th franchises. So I would say that the way that this movie, like, grasped audiences' attention then and now really makes this, like, the typical American slasher summer film.
And moving into the number 5 slot, one of your near and dear movies here, Friday the 13th, Part 7, also known colloquially as Jason versus Carrie.
Yes, I was about to say this is The New Blood is a spoof of Carrie. And one of my favorite scenes in Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood, is Tina Shepard, the main protagonist, is relationship with Dr. Cruz, because he is so arrogant and malevolent and just doesn't believe that she has this psychic talent where she is able to move objects with her mind. So the one scene where she is alone with him and she is just anxiously trying to convince him that, hey, I have this talent, I have this issue, please help me. And he's just like, concentrate. And with great aggression, she is finally able to move the object and, of course, crash a few things in the room. And what was really funny is, I mean, he is just so stunned. And then he was like, well, how did you do that? And she looks at him and she goes, I was thinking of you. And this scene really brings out, too, I was going to say, some of my life situations where if I felt that I couldn't do 100 jumping jacks or run 6 miles, or say if my boss wanted me to research a case where I didn't want to because there were too many complexities. Again, all I had to do was, with the above that I just mentioned, just think of exes, former bosses, and other people I resented, and that's what got a good kick out of it. So that was one of my favorite elements in the movie, because it was just, hey, I mean, like, she was able to prove to him that she has this psychic connection and that she was more believable than he anticipated.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things about the entire movie is the true villain of the movie, of course, is played by Terry Kaiser, also known as
Dr. Cruz.
Oh, what's his other famous role he's most famous for?
Oh my goodness, you got me there.
He actually played Bernie at Weekend at Bernie's.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you. And I was going to say, whoever is watching this right now, please don't laugh at me, because I was oblivious to what James just said. I honestly did not know. I mean, I knew Terry Kaiser, but I did not know that specific role. So again, please do not laugh.
Well, you know what? He's got experience playing a corpse. It served him well in this movie.
Yes, for sure. But again, in this movie, I really focus on Tina Shepard's character, not because she's the main protagonist, and again, she's got the elements and the similarities of Carrie, but I was going to say, in addition to her talent, I mean, she's also a very sheltered, yet gullible girl who is coping with the death of her father. I mean, she believes that she is at fault with this by killing him off with her telekinetic powers. And then when she returns back to Camp Crystal Lake, I mean, not only is she trying to improve herself, but I mean, she makes friends, she finds romance, she kills off Jason. I mean, this movie, I was going to say, is going up to one of the best ratings.
I think a more fitting subtitle would have been How I Spent My Summer Vacation.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's not every day. I mean, it's not the typical summer vacation where, you meet new people. I mean, you find someone you're attracted to, but I mean, killing someone with your mind, I mean, just in all different ways. I mean, like just knocking them down with house plants, breaking the steps, electrocuting them, in any creative way that she could think of to kill this legendary serial killer.
Yeah, I'm not cheating. I'm not using the Wikipedia here, so I'm just trying to go on my film knowledge here. The actress who actually played the main character in the movie, that's Lar Park Lincoln?
Lar Park Lincoln, who actually appears at local horror convention centers. I have not had a chance to meet her yet, but hopefully we will cross paths because I am told that, again, she's very welcoming, very loving to her fans, very extroverted, and she is willing to talk about a movie that happened more than 30 years ago.
Yeah, she was also in one of my all-time favorite guilty pleasure movies of all time, House 2, The Second Story.
And what year did that come out?
I think that was just right before this one. That was 86.
86, okay, so that's a 2-year difference. This movie came out in 88. And also, on the side note, Lar Park Lincoln is actually a breast cancer survivor. So we do want to praise her for her, I was going to say, not only her battle, but her bravery and her dedication and her compassion and her, I mean, just her patience and her gratefulness for fighting this disease.
And when you look back on Friday the 13th, Part 7, I think probably in the greater scope of the series, the two big things went on in this movie, of course, Kane Hodder's introduction as Jason. And the other one is, this is the movie where the MPAA just absolutely destroyed this movie. So we're still kind of waiting for a full director's cut, aren't we?
We are. And also, I do want to say, I do want to outline Kane Hodder. Yes, this is the first Kane Hodder movie, and I actually was able to interview him back at Days of the Dead Atlanta 2015. Again, I was still very new to journalism and interviewing and questions and answers at the time, but overall it went well. Since he portrays like a villainous creature, he may come off very intimidating, but he was willing to talk about how he used to do stunts and how he was bullied as a kid, which led him to audition for roles playing the antagonist. And he also explained that with the stunts and with his roles in the Friday the 13th series, I mean, he wasn't doing it just for money. He wasn't doing it to be famous. He stated that it was very therapeutic for him, given his past, and of course also given his experience with acting. It was just like the whole philosophy of being able to portray in a legendary horror movie that really attracted him to the part, and of course the screenplay.
Oh yeah, I mean, people kind of who aren't really huge horror fans like us really don't know the backstory of Kane Hodder. I mean, he was almost killed in a fire stunt early in his career. So, yes. And one of the big stunt pieces in this movie is actually him being immolated again. So for him to come back from that near-death experience to be set on fire again just shows you just how dedicated and driven this guy is. And I think he does not get enough credit as an actor and a stunt person.
He does, and I do give him credit because I'm sure that the part about the fire was, brought back a lot of disturbing memories. It was very traumatizing to him, but he did his job. I mean, he played the part, and he really stuck out. I mean, needless to say, he is a very strong-willed man, and I am glad that I got to interview him. And he has returned to Days of the Dead and Mad Monster Party and even a couple other horror conventions. And fans just love him.
So from 1982, it is Friday the 13th, Part 3, coming in at number 4. So many things to talk about in this movie. Probably the most iconic, of course, is the birth of Hockey Mask Jason. But there's a lot
I was about to say, in this film, Jason's hockey mask is introduced. So if anything, this is Jason Voorhees now.
It's one of those things where, do you think that when they're actually writing the script for Friday the 13th, they would have imagined this thing would have had 11 sequels and spawned merchandise and, billions of dollars a year in annual revenue?
Right. In addition to script writing they actually added more to the settings of Camp Crystal Lake, where they called it Higgins Haven, where Chris Higgins, the main protagonist, invites her friends to spend there for a weekend, even though she has recollections of disturbing memories of when a deformed man attacked her, but her boyfriend Rick assures her that everything will be okay. So, but again, before the slaughtering starts, she does ease up, feels a little bit better. Now, I do want to point out that Shelley brought out the aspects of this film to a certain degree, again, as a practical joker, also as the unlikable introvert. And if I ever get to interview Larry Zerner, I am curious. I will probably have a zillion questions. How he went from an overweight and insecure non-womanizer to a fatality, then blossomed into a brilliant entertainment and patent lawyer. How about that? Going from slaughter to law.
That's one of the guys where I've been penciling in to do an interview with him for years and years. I know a couple of years back, I actually wrote a pretty big piece about the copyright hold-up with the Friday the 13th franchise. But who would have imagined?
Yes. And during that time, again, not only is it, a low-budget movie, horror movies had a different perspective back then, but he did analyze in exclusive interviews that, back then he was, he had the fro, he was overweight, he had a very eccentric type of personality that the director was like, okay, I'm picking you, and that's how he auditioned for the role.
Yeah, I think it was in the Camp Crystal Lake documentary. They said they actually found him doing advertisements for one of the Mad Max movies outside a theater.
Yes.
So
yes, I think that's what introduced Larry Zerner to Friday the 13th Part 3.
All right, so when you think Friday the 13th Part 3, you have to think about Friday the 13th Part 3D, because that's the big gimmick for the movie.
You bet.
One of the problems, though, is we haven't actually seen it kind of translate into a true 3D copy since then, so in a way, it's almost kind of become like a piece of lost media.
In some ways, yeah. But again, I do like to call it Friday the 13th 3D because, again, you do see the highlights and the elements of why the movie was in 3D. And if anything, it makes it look more phenomenal, just seeing things like up close and slurry, and it has more of like a personal look to it.
Yeah, out of all of the scenes in the movie, I think probably my favorite is the one where they're actually showing off like the 3D tricks. They're completely pointless and add nothing to the movie, like the part with the yo-yo.
Oh my goodness, yes, the yo-yo and also the juggling. Yes, the juggling and the yo-yo, and also the making of the popcorn was also irrelevant as well. But at the same time, it does bring a very comical part to the movie.
And there's some pretty good death scenes this one. I think Rick has one of the most iconic demises in the entire series, actually having his head squeezed open in 3 dimensions. But
yes.
But the thing that really stood out to me, I think this is probably the most underrated, maybe the entire series, is the ending, where you kind of have the twist on the original Friday the 13th ending, where you actually have our lead heroine escaping, only to see Jason emerge from the second story floor and chase after, which I thought was absolutely terrifying.
It was, and just the thought of seeing like Chris, it leads audiences to believe, okay, did she actually see this deformed Jason from the story house? Well, not the story house, but did she see him from the house? I mean, was she just hallucinating? And also, it was very devastating just to see her just like all shaken up and just delirious. And as she climbs into the car with the cops, and then when they turn around, just trying to assure her that everything is okay. I mean, she screams out in panic for no reason. But I like how in the film, how they analyze saying, hey, she's the sole survivor. She's been through a lot the night before, but still. And I will admit, sometimes that ending, that particular scene brings tears to my eyes, because there are some people who go through those treacherous type of situations where, I mean, they go psychotic. I mean, they just go crazy, that to the extent where they are no longer aware of their surroundings. And this is what happens to Chris Higgins in Friday the 13th, Part 3.
For me, Part 3 is one of those movies where, like I said, with Friday the 13th, Part 8, that was the movies where I think it has better parts than it does whole. I think this is the kind of movie where it actually has a better whole than parts. Where I can't name like maybe one or two scenes that make the movie work. Just the entire thing is so well put together, great atmosphere, great pace, great acting. It just all comes together to a really great, satisfying whole.
Yes, and that's why we have it on one of our top points.
All right, and heading into number 3, and I think when you look at the top 3 here, this is everybody's top 3. It's just a matter of putting them in the right ordinal position. But as a Georgia boy, I'm proud of this one. Coming in number 3, Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. Where do we even begin on this one? This is going to take a while.
Yes. And let me start by saying again, I was mainly amused by the wild soundtrack. Yeah, mainly amused by the wild soundtrack that goes with the under-rehearsed acting. And again, I had stated before that the movie was filmed in parts of Rutledge, Georgia, with Camp Daniel Morgan. And it opens with Tommy Jarvis, the main protagonist, where he plans to exhume Jason, but after having traumatizing flashbacks from Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter, and during a storm, the lightning bolts strike, and the inevitable happens, which comes to the title, Jason Lives. And he is considered the zombie Jason in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, really from beginning to end, this is just a great, great genre movie. It's one of those rare horror comedy movies I think actually gets both combinations correct. It's not too funny, but it's also not too serious. And really, how can you hate any movie that literally begins with Horseshack getting his guts ripped out?
Also, and I saw that with the upcoming Days of the Dead Atlanta, assuming that they will happen in August, I mean, who knows with the current situation, fingers crossed, some of the Friday the 13th Part 6 cast members will be appearing. One is Tom Matthews, who portrayed Tommy Jarvis, Carrie Newman, who played Paula, the redheaded counselor, who is on my list of interviewing because, again, she is currently a professor of psychology up in Vermont, and I'd really like to get a good story on how she went from one of the Friday the 13th cast members and targets to an associate professor living up in a small town of Vermont. And the director, Tom McLaughlin, will also be there, and that's another one who was on my list for the bucket of interviews because I really believe that I can collect a lot of information from him, such as what it was like to work on set, the pros and cons of the film, the interactions of the actors, because again, James, I mean, we seem to be on the same page with really enjoying Friday the 13th, Part 6. Jason Lives.
There are just so many great small scenes. It's kind of one of those movies where it's subtle but not subtle at the same time. Like the opening introduction, you got the pastiche of the James Bond intro. You got the one character who I actually think is the director's spouse actually trying to buy off Jason with a American Express card. There are just so many. There's just so many, really goofy, idiosyncratic things about this movie, but it all works. It comes together to a really satisfying whole. I'm trying to think what would be my absolute favorite part of the movie. Again, there's just so many really small, great things. It's kind of hard to single out one thing.
Yes. But since we're on the subject, I will single out, yes, going back to the entertainment and the, I'm trying to think of a good strong word, but the part about the American Express. I do like the beginning of that scene where we're driving to Camp Crystal Lake, and then Jason Voorhees is right there. Like, he's just merely standing there, not saying anything, and it was just to say, they are so oblivious that they're about to be his next victims by saying, hey, just drive up to him, he'll move. And he's just like, and she's just like, okay, we're going to scare that. And he's just standing there. I mean, he's just got like the knife in his hand. I mean, like, he's just ready to kill them. And then once her boyfriend dies off, again, that's when she says, here, take this, gives him the American Express, looks around. I mean, she's so gullible, she doesn't know where he is, and then all of a sudden turns around, and then all of a sudden he just stabs her in the mouth and just dives her right into the water. And then you see her credit cards and all her purse accessories just flow freely in the water. I mean, that is just a very funny part in the movie.
Yeah, there is just so much great gallows humor in the movie. I think probably my favorite bit is a throwaway line where one of the kids hiding under the bed waiting for Jason to maul them to death. And he turns to the other kid and says, so what were you going to be when you grew up?
Right. And also, with the kids in the film, it's also a very touching because you know that, like, even though that they're in Jason's territory, he won't kill them, which is good. He will only kill off the obnoxious camp counselors, and of course there was the military and the couples and anyone else who gets in his way. But again, I am so relieved and touched by the thought that he will not kill the kids because, hey, they need a chance to grow up.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you always try to kind of find like a psychological or philosophical angle to what Jason represents. So by this point, he's such a firmly established character in the horror genre. Do you think there is any sort of like deeper subtext to what Jason's supposed to represent as a film character?
It's hard to say that because, again, this is the film where Jason is considered, Jason is considered the zombie Jason, and I think that's why that they title it Jason Lives. And again, it's also the mid-1980s, but this was also the first film where Jason revives not only on his own, but there were some specifics to his arising. Like in this case, it was the lightning bolt strike, and then he just rises from the dead. So I think that just brings out the aspects of Jason being this again non-speaking, villainous, but also non-living character, which makes the film, I was going to say, more gory to a certain extent.
Yep, and now we come to the moment of truth. In life, we're all faced with difficult choices. Do we go with Pepsi or Coke, Ginger or Marianne, the ultimate horror enigma, Friday the 13th Part 2, or Friday the 13th Part 4?
Okay, I'll say Friday the 13th Part 4. Oh my gosh, yes, the fourth installment. And again, as I was saying before, this brings out the epitome of horror because, again, Jason is dead, but spontaneously revives and terrorizes his victims. And out of all the franchises, I love this film because it has a remarkable cast such as Crispin Glover, Kimberly Beck, Judy Aronson, and the plot doesn't specifically focus on the typical horny and corrupted teenagers as it had in the previous films, but centers more on Jason Voorhees and the main protagonist. And one scene where Tommy Jarvis impersonates Jason as a boy, shaving his head. And once he knocks him down, he continually hits Jason, goes crazy, and when he and his sister Trish embrace, the disturbed look on his face lets audiences know that this is not the final chapter. It's just not over. But overall, there were outstanding performances, especially with the socially awkward Crispin Glover, where I know I can't swear over this, but he was known as the dead F word. Yes. his his socially inexperienced personality was known as the dead F word. So that made the movie very comical because toward the middle of the movie, he got laid and then he got killed by Jason. So again, this movie goes from horror slasher to a black comedy movie, which is why, I absolutely love this one.
Yeah, on a personal level, I would say that Friday the 13th Part 2 is probably the better movie objectively. That's certainly my favorite movie in the entire Friday the 13th canon. But I think probably Part 4 is more emblematic and representative of the entire Jason series. I mean, when people think Friday the 13th movies, I think Friday the 13th Part 4 is what they envision in their head of what the movie's supposed to be like.
Yes, and also with the second installment, Jason is introduced. And again, although the plot of Friday the 13th Part 2 is set 5 years later, the ignorant camp counselors still return to the shore of Crystal Lake, and Paul, the head counselor, narrates the story of the previous murders with the boy drowning, and then with Alice, and then Mrs. Voorhees, which draws attention to everybody. But Paul still proclaims that Jason is the legend, so that gives everybody the impression that Jason is a hoax. And also, and I had said this before, but another good element about this movie is it's a very epic Jason costume, because it's not every day that you see a serial killer with a potato sack on his head, especially if you're trying to introduce the new killer.
Yeah, the thing I've always heard is it came out right after The Elephant Man was released, so that was kind of like the big thing in vogue. But yeah.
This was 1981, so again, we were still new to the 80s decade, but also at the same time, I mean, the effects, in the acting and the scenery in that style, it was slowly bringing out to what will go into the 1980s decade.
And I think, when I speak to most fans, it seems like Friday the 13th Part 2 and Part 4, the consensus picks for the two best movies in the genre. And it kind of dawned on me that I think both these movies, and you can feel free to disagree, to me, they're also the two best acted movies in the entire series. Would you kind of feel that way?
Yes. I mean, I think the acting is phenomenal. And I will point out a scene where there is, a great performance by Amy Steele in Part 2 as Ginny Field imitates of Pamela Voorhees. I mean, again, I admire the acting where she puts on Pamela Voorhees' sweater and then does a parental act with Jason, instructing him to kneel down. I mean, I love the film and it just gets very intense how it goes from Ginny to Pamela Voorhees and then transitions back and then back and forth. And how she's saying, "Mother is talking to you. Good boy, Jason, kneel down. Good boy, Mother is talking to you." And I'll have to say, good boy, Jason, you almost got slaughtered. That is before you saw your mother's chopped off head.
Yeah, and between these two movies, I mean, just the amazing number of kills. I mean, we could be here all day going over our favorites. You got the wheelchair machete to the head. You've got the corkscrew to the hand, followed by the machete through the stag film. I mean, what am I leaving out here?
And just like the original Friday the 13th, again, that there were some diverse ways for killing off the camp counselors who would not listen. And it is still unknown how Paul dies in the ending. It's just, again, it's still a very confusing moment in the ending where supposedly he is alive, and then Jason comes out and attacks Ginny, but in the end he is nowhere to be found. So did Jason use one of his, various ways to kill him? What exactly happens to him?
Yeah, and I think probably in Part 2 you probably get the more complete depiction of who Jason is. They actually kind of show him not being a supernatural character, but actually just kind of a weird, reclusive guy who lives out in the woods. He's even got his own shack. Whereas later movies kind of abandoned that and kind of said, he's a supernatural force, kind of like the shark in Jaws, where he's just kind of roaming about. So what do you think about the depiction of Jason's two movies? Do you have a preference on how he's presented?
Again, I'm going to go with Friday the 13th Part 4 with that, because this is the second movie where Jason has on the hockey mask, and I think that that's what he is most notably known for. So either way, that's, the hockey mask, his approaches, his stalking, his watching, his, going toward his next victims, that definitely is a strong element in Friday the 13th Part 4.
Yeah, I think that kind of brings us to the big central point of the entire interview here. When you just look back at all these Jason movies and, the good ones, the bad ones, the great ones, there's just such a sense of fun to them that you just don't get from modern horror movies. So what do you think made these movies so different from what we're seeing nowadays?
I was going to say, that is a very good question. James, it just ties into what was not available then, but is available now. Like, I think nowadays, there was more involved with the acting. Just more work. You see remakes and movies today where, again, like, the actors are basically just looking up at the scenes because it's all like techno type of work. Whereas in these, you had to design your props. Like, you had to design the set. It just required a lot more physical work back then. And of course, when we do meet the Friday the 13th actors at the horror conventions, it's just very astonishing how the nostalgia comes back even after all these years. And again, it's just because it's just unbelievable. That this is nearly 40 years ago. And again, they are not cult classics just for the Halloween season, but for year round. And even with the current pandemic situation, these are the type of movies that as horror fans, you could just binge watch all the time.
Yeah, one of the things I've always wanted to do is just have all 8 of the original Friday the 13th movies shown in one sitting. That's been like a childhood dream since I was like 8. So one of these days, I'll get around to it.
Yes, I was going to say, if for those, for the movies that you haven't watched, I was going to say, hadn't really gotten a decent glimpse of it, you're missing out. So you've got a lot of catching up to do.
And I can't think of a better note to go out on than that. Friday the 13th, 40 years later, is still as popular as ever. In fact, it may actually be more popular now than it was back in the day. People forget these movies were crusaded against. The Roger Eberts and Leonard Maltins all hated them. But it seems like almost like they're kind of turning a corner now. They're actually kind of starting to recognize these movies and give them the respect they deserve. So do you think that after all these years, we're finally starting to see the Friday the 13th movies actually kind of get some recognition and accolades?
If anything, they are becoming more alive. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, to a certain degree that they have, because I think it makes fans appreciate where, as they watch the movies now, it just makes them kind of reflect back to when the movies first came out. And again, it's just low budget. They were under rehearsed. There was also limited scenes. Also, I was going to say limited were the supplies where they can improvise to avoid injuries, and especially in the more dramatic, bizarre scenes. So I think today, as we watch them, we really do start to appreciate not only the actor's hard work, but the screenplayer, the director, the producer, even the set design, for the tremendous work that they did, and how they are still admired by us 40 years later.
Well, I could talk about the Jason mythos pretty much all day. It's one of my most passionate cinematic subjects. I'm not quite sure how, but it is. But that's the way it is for a lot of people. All right, so I'll let you have the final word here, Kristen. Anything you want to say to our listeners, viewers, readers out there?
I think I have pretty much analyzed my perspective on the Friday the 13th franchises. And again, for those who just haven't had time, or, for those who have Amazon or on-demand Netflix, definitely watch and pay more attention to the plot and the different grotesque killings, and, of course, just the whole story of Friday the 13th, because we're already halfway through the summer, and again, this is the time to watch the summer slaughters.
All right, and just to sign off here, James Swift, founder of Uncommon Journalism. If you like what you hear, just let us know. We'll try to get some more podcasts coming down the line. And I want to thank Kristen again. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, good night to all, and have a very spooky night.